quickly close down the government. And that sort of brinkmanship I think we'll see, and that'll just breed more uncertainty as the markets second guess what politicians are going to do and how it's going to unfold going into the early part of next year. When I look at China, when I move from the US to China, what does it mean to me? In the US economy will have a slower recovery than the very slow recovery they've already got, I think, for the next couple of years. That'll be the bottom line of that, with a bit more volatility in financial markets. When I turn to China, everyone says, oh, Chinese growth will continue, it was very strong. I don't know what Chinese growth is. I was in China a couple of years ago. I built 2 or 3 businesses in China, plants and so on, from the bottom up, hard yards in China, very difficult work. But I was there in the middle of the September quarter, in the middle of the month of September, I should say, and the government announced the growth rate for the September quarter. Now in Australia, we couldn't announce that growth rate until the first week of December, but they could do it in China before the quarter was finished. So all I can say is I'm just a little bit sceptical about what those growth numbers really mean. No doubt it's been growing extremely strongly. It's had investment somewhere between 50 and 60% of GDP for a long time. And that's an obscene number to an economist when you think about that order of magnitude. And there are massive pockets of overinvestment now, particularly in property. I was in UWE last year to get an award from some Chinese group, excuse me, and a new convention centre was where the award was being held. They were still finishing it while we were walking onto the stage, literally still finishing it. But all around there, residential and commercial construction everywhere, all empty. So I've got to ask myself, how was that financed? It was financed by lending from the regional banks. So there's massive non-performing loans, and when you do the numbers, as best as you can rely on them, the bubble in property in China is much bigger than the subprime crisis in the United States by a long way. And so I think they've got that problem. They've got a problem with inequality between the rich and the poor. We built a plant in Qingdao to build luxury buses and coaches. Our CEO was to have a package that was of Western standards, and the factory worker on the factory floor was paid $1 Australian a day. And I said, this is unsustainable within that company, let alone if that's a national problem, and it is a national problem. You go to Western China and find out how much of a difference there is between the average income levels there and in the industrial belt of Eastern China, from Shanghai, Beijing and so on. So I think that there are some very big structural issues which say to me that Chinese growth will recover, but it won't recover perhaps as fast as people are hoping. And from our point of view, the resources boom is over in terms of prices. It's probably over for a few years in terms of volumes as well. And I'm not sure that we are really ready for that in this country. When I look at Australia today, there's no doubt that in relative terms we look terrific. Low unemployment by number, measured number. I'm not better to say what that means. Unemployment doesn't mean anything. The definition of employment is that you work more than 1 hour per week. That's the definition of employment. So if you work more than 1 hour per week, you're not unemployed. Okay, so somewhere between 1 hour and 35 or 40 hours a week is a different issue. So underemployment, the extent to which people work less than they would otherwise work or want to work, is a big number. Also, if you look at the number of people on disability benefits in this country, it's about 860,000, 880,000, about 500,000 or so on unemployment benefits. Somehow there's been a reclassification of people in there. Anyway, by world standards, we've got a 5-point-something% unemployment rate. We're relatively good. Our inflation looks good, and we've sustained growth through the global financial crisis. But when you break it up, the bits that are growing are related to the resources sector, and the rest of the economy is pretty flat. Retail is very flat, and very big structural changes as people change the nature of their retail demands. My wife keeps telling me you've got to declutter. I've been a great collector all my life, so it's a problem. We've got a big room in the back of my house. We've got a big ballroom, seats 200 people. It's full of all my stuff. The rest of the house has been decluttered. But that's happening Australia-wide. People are not spending as much as they used to spend on things like that. They're not collecting things and, acquiring things. They've slowed up their expenditure patterns dramatically. And if you see a big drift towards online shopping rather than retail shopping in retail outlets and so on. Structural changes. People are starting to save more, repay their mortgage more, spend less. Retail's flat, related to that. Wholesale's flat. Manufacturing is flat anecdotally every day. You hear a story almost every day. Another plant closing, another business closing, people being laid off. Property is very flat. House prices are still falling in large parts of the country. Certainly commercial, residential and industrial property has got a question mark over it. The funds related to that, in which in one of my roles we invest in, very concerned about some of those exposures going forward. Domestic tourism is flat because of the strength of the dollar. Education is flat. A lot of people don't come, including not just Indians but others, on the basis of the exchange rate. So I can go on. Parts of services, the only people who are making money are lawyers, accountants, people like that. They're the services that are doing okay, the rest of them are suffering. And so if you take the resource sector out, what happens? The economy starts to look very different. Growth numbers start to get lower, and there is a question as to how much the economy will slow. The government is committed to a budget surplus. I don't know why, because I can't see an economic argument for the budget surplus. It's a political objective of both sides of politics. Got to have a budget surplus. It's like we've got to stand up for motherhood and apple pie. We've got to have a budget surplus. It's a meaningless economic objective if the economy is slowing down. But even on the logic they use with the global financial crisis, to avoid a recession we've got to have government spending. Now the economy is slowing down, we don't need to have government spending. The arguments don't add up in very simple terms. So we have a commitment to a budget surplus, but the government is chasing the economy down. The revenue numbers are getting less all the time. Corporate profits are less. Capital gains taxes are less. Revenue, no resource rent tax at all, because they're not going to pay that anyway. But the activities come off anyway as well. So that the revenue base is chasing the economy down. So every time Mr. Swan announces that he's got to review his budget numbers, the revenue base is going to be weaker than he thought it was going to be the last time he had a look at it. And look, last year the first budget estimate I should say of the budget deficit was $12 billion. Finished at $44 billion. Last year he was chasing it down. This year he's going to chase it down even more. It takes a few years for these things to flow through. And so in those terms, he'll never get a budget surplus. I mean, shouldn't say never, because you can fiddle the numbers and they're pretty good at moving things from one side of the end of June 30 to the other and so on. But I still think even with reasonable fiddling they won't get it. I don't think they will be able to announce a budget surplus, so we'll probably have an election before that number's due to be released. That's the first hint on the timing of an election. So in those circumstances, why are we in this position? Well, we had a very strong response to the global financial crisis. As I said before, a rapid increase in government spending, threw a lot of cash into the system, cushioned the system. Interest rates came off a bit, not enough, but they came off a bit. But then as soon as things started to get going, the Reserve Bank started to put interest rates up again. And they should never have been reduced to the near level they were reduced to. They should have gone right down. And so we've ended up with our interest rates way out of line as well. And those interest rates are biting, either directly from the Reserve Bank or indirectly via the impact on the banks not passing those interest rate reductions on. And as a consequence, we've had a strong dollar, high interest rates. So I look at the country from outside today objectively. I see our cost of living is about twice what it ought to be. Our productivity is about half what it ought to be. Our interest rates are more than double what they ought to be. In my view, you could have an official interest rate of 1.5%. It wouldn't be passed on necessarily by the banks, but you could do a deal to have it passed on. So, I'm worried that we are going into a period of very difficult economic activity in this country. We will have 12 or 18 months of flat activity, and we'll have an election before then. Now, I know you don't want me to talk about politics, so I won't say anything about Mr Abbott versus Mr Gillard, but the political system is not helping in this country. Because we have such an incessant, globally it's true too. Politics today is a 24-hour media game. You know, who's going to win the media today on whatever issue is there on the day? Whether you create the issue or it's created for you, you take a position. And you tell all your troops to say the same thing. Every morning, every parliamentarian gets up and he gets his little email and say this and don't say anything else. Say this and don't say anything else. And they do, and they all, you get them on TV, go and watch them on Sky, Liberal, Labor, they're on message all the time. They don't say anything different. And the leaders go out and they have their soundbite, and the soundbite becomes what dominates the news. So if that's the news that night, television news that night, and front page of the paper the next day we do something else, another issue, another thing. So you don't have any medium-term structural thinking, you don't have any medium-term structural planning. And nobody's solving problems, and in terms of matters to people like yourself, there's really no governance. They're not governing, they're not solving problems, they're not thinking strategically, they're not operating in a medium to long-term context, they're operating within a 24-hour cycle. And people say, when's the next election start? It started the day after the last election. Every day is an element of the campaign for the next election. And the thing that worries me most in political terms is negativity. And in that difficult context, 24-hour cycle, you've got massively negative, very personal politics. In the US, I've never seen a situation like we've just seen where both leaders were disliked and they were negative, so negative about each other. Even Bill Clinton described it as hate politics. And why did Obama win? Because right at the start of Romney's time, they just saturated the media in those battleground states with what was wrong with Romney. He didn't pay tax and he didn't work and he didn't understand the average person and so on. And that did the damage, and from that point on, he was never going to win. He was never going to win because they did such a character assassination on him. And we've seen it here in Australia. Abbott got into Gillard because she lied before the last election campaign about carbon tax, and then Gillard's now recently had tack dogs out on Abbott saying that he's a misogynist and he doesn't understand women and, blah, blah, blah. And in that process we've had, no substantive, sensible debate about anything. So I'm pessimistic about what the political system can generate. If you look at what the challenge is today, the challenge is to make a transition as a global society to a low-carbon, low-debt world. And you stop and think about that. It's easy to say low-carbon, low-debt. They're struggling on both fronts, making very little progress in terms of carbon emissions, CO2 emissions globally or in any particular country, and you're making very little progress on debt in those countries that are heavily exposed. You've had some adjustment in personal debts, you've had some adjustment in corporate debts, you've had some rebuilding of bank balance sheets, but the other side of that is most budget deficits have gone much bigger. So the US has done a bit of a turnaround in those domestic and personal areas, personal and business areas, but the US budget deficit is nearly 10% of GDP and debt's approaching 100% of GDP. And these are big changes that are going to take a long time to reverse. And so, there's not much of a transition being made. Let me just say I better say something about carbon tax, carbon pricing and so on. I said a transition to a low carbon world is a major challenge. I actually believe the science on carbon and CO2 emissions. And the reason I believe it is that I'm not a scientist. Right? So how do I know there's a problem? I can't look out the window and find there's a problem. I can't see it, can't feel it, can't touch it. The only reason I know that we have a carbon emissions, a CO2 emissions problem, is that something very strange happened, and that is that scientists actually agreed. Scientists never agree. They disagree. It's the nature of science that you disagree. You can test each other's hypotheses, you can test each other's research conclusions, yet 95+% of world recognised climate scientists, peer assessed climate scientists, say there's a massive problem with global warming. And that if we don't do something about it, the globe will at least increase by 2% in temperature by 2050. The World Bank came out last week and basically implied that we missed that by 100%, could increase by 4% plus by the end of the century. Now, that's good enough for me, that's the problem. And each country's got an individual responsibility to do something about it. As an economist, obviously pricing carbon is a fundamental way to do it. Not the only way. You can ban incandescent light bulbs, you can require certain renewables targets, you can mandate things, control things, you can have carbon farming initiatives and so on. But putting a price on carbon is important. But in the frustration that I've felt in this area for the last 12, 15 years that I've been involved, I think it comes down to a much simpler thing, and that is investment. To talk about opportunities, there should be a minor, if not major, technological revolution in response to the challenge of climate change, which is loaded with business opportunity, massively loaded with business opportunity. I personally, when I set up a thing called the National Business Leaders Forum and Sustainable Development back in, we set it up in about the end of about 1999, 2000. The idea was to educate the business community about the opportunities, the business opportunities that would come from the challenge of climate change. If governments responded, if they put a price on carbon, if they start to cut back on CO2 emissions, they'll be looking for alternative technologies, alternative energy efficiency savings, and so on and so forth. And each one of those can generate new industries and new businesses and new opportunities. We met amongst ourselves for the first couple of years because nobody was the slightest bit interested in the business community in any of that. About 6 or 7 years ago we brought Al Gore to Australia to try and raise the profile of the debate. This was just before he put out An Inconvenient Truth. In fact, the speech that I had him give here in Sydney was an inconvenient truth. We encouraged him to get it out, and it was instrumental with the Stern Report and other things to change the whole nature of the global debate. But business community was still not all that interested. He was dispensed with as a failed politician and an entertainer. He wasn't thought of as a serious, raising serious global challenges. So I myself set up a series of businesses to prove the point that you can make a quid out of responding properly to climate change. We set up a household garbage recycling plant at Eastern Creek. Sort the garbage into paper, plastic, glass, metal. They're all income streams. But importantly, take the methane gas out, turn it into electricity, use electricity to run the plant, sell the rest into the grid. Income streams. And what you're left with, 99% organically pure. You can landfill that if you want to, because landfilling is a barbaric practice. But then it's a viable business model. And if I start to get carbon credits for some of that, I get another income stream. Then we did energy efficient light bulbs. We built, I think, the world's most energy efficient light bulb and started distributing them globally. In another business, we built the world's largest biodiesel plant in Singapore. Worked on with green data centres, and now we've got a whole host of other technologies we're working on. Every one of those spins out as an opportunity from a sensible response to climate change. Now, we could make them work before there was a price on carbon. Put a price on carbon, I've got another layer of benefit that I'm going to make in terms of an income stream somewhere, assuming accountants can start measuring these things and we get international standards on them and so on. But that'll come. I mean, there'll be a global carbon price, there'll be a global trading system in carbon, inevitable. Again, another great opportunity for the finance people in the room. I'm surprised you're so slow in getting onto this one. If you've been able to financially engineer a crisis in terms of subprime lending, you ought to be able to generate some sort of global market in carbon pricing. So I see enormous opportunity in a sensible response. There's a lot of opportunity in deleveraging, obviously, and restructuring of companies' balance sheets, and you guys are closer as accountants to that than most people are. You can see the opportunities that come when you restructure a company, you deleverage a company, inject the appropriate level of equity. I'm not saying it's easy because people don't want to invest money. Anyway, the final point I was going to make on climate change is, having said all that, we've just launched a project about 18 months ago called the Asset Owners Disclosure Project. And it's taking the view that what matters in that whole process of all these alternative technologies, alternative in industries and so on, is money, investment. How do we marshal investment to create it? So I know in my own experience in those companies, it's hard to get people to invest. People don't want to put their money at risk in an early stage alternative technology company. So how do you generate that investment fund? So we've come up with this thing called the Asset Owners Disclosure Project, where what we're doing is surveying and rating the top 1,000 pension and superannuation funds, insurance companies, sovereign wealth funds, endowment funds in the world. These are funds that own more than about $5 billion US each. In total, those 1,000 control $60 trillion worth of funds. That is, in terms of the numbers, they own more than 50% of every listed company on every stock market in the world. They are the financial powerhouse of the entire global financial system. And what we're doing is sending out a survey. We've sent out surveys and asked them to tell us two things in particular, a lot of questions, but two things. How are you managing climate risk? And what is the carbon intensity of your investment? Now, when we look at that 60 trillion, our estimate is that 55% of that is invested in high carbon industries, and only 2% is invested in low carbon industries. So how do I generate investment funds? If I can get the 2% up to 5 or 6% of the 60 trillion, I've got enough globally basically to fund the technological revolution that ought to come. So we're going to drive them, we're going to maim them and blame them and shame them until they respond. But if that's not enough, we've also got a bottom-up strategy. That's the top-down strategy. Bottom-up strategy, we've developed a social media platform called Vital Few. And Vital Few allows individual members of superannuation funds, pension funds, beneficiaries to write to, email to their trustees, their directors, who have a fiduciary responsibility to answer these questions, and ask them, what are you doing about the management of climate risk? And justify to me the carbon intensity of your investment. Now, we're getting a little bit of pushback from the funds, of course, but I don't know why. Because they are demanding of companies they invested in full transparency as to the carbon intensity of their investments, but they are prepared to apply the same standards of transparency and accountability to themselves. My point is, you cannot continue to defend the indefensible. They'll give in and we'll win this argument. We're starting to get a lot of global interest. We're about to release our first ratings in the first week of December, and I think it will become a major issue over the next couple of years. But we've got to motivate the people at the bottom through the Vital Few while we survey them on the top, from the top down. So I think that that you can win this argument about climate change, and if governments are going to dick around trying to decide whether or not they're going to price carbon and who's going to score what point and whether Abbott's going to try and frighten people and Gillard's going to half do the job, while they're doing all that, we can drive investment where it's got to go, and you can actually get the response you need. Because in portfolio terms, how does an asset owner manage that fund to minimise carbon risk? They can't go off to the financial markets and lay off the risk, because there's no financial market and there's no derivative market. They can't insure the risk. The best and now and perhaps the only effective portfolio response is to diversify within their portfolio, to increase the percentage they have in low carbon investments to offset the exposure they have, the risk they're taking in high carbon investments. Now, the difficulty is you have asset owners the asset owners at the top that own those funds. You've got funds managers in the middle who are motivated by different criteria. They don't think long term, they think short term. Quarterly returns, right? So how do you get them to think about the long term, or the asset owner to do it? I'll use one example to finish on this. I advise this group in the Australian Olympic Committee. We made money out of the Olympics, and we have these funds that we manage. And the idea was we made 99 million out of the Olympics media deal we did in 2000. Keep that money as a capital amount, manage it as best we can, take the income and fund the Australian Olympic Committee with the income. That's what we do. Set it up in the late 90s, early part of the first decade of this century. Okay, so we were quite successful. Started with 99. We still have about 120, and we've paid out over 85 million to by investment standards, a pretty successful 12 years. But how did we do that? Because when it came to the GFC, mid-2007, I said to our funds managers, Barclays, Schroders, Maple Brown Abbott, whoever they were, Lend Lease, we don't like the exposure to the stock market. I reckon the stock market's going to bucket out by about 50%. Oh, well, that's okay. They said, just underweight this and overweight that and you'll be okay. No, I said the whole market's going to go down 50% on average. Some will go down 60, some will go down 40, but the whole thing's going down. And as an asset owner, I can drive it, right? We moved out of the stock market. We moved into cash. Sit at 6%. 6% return against minus 50. We were looking pretty good. And that's where the asset owner's got to drive this change. They're the ones who've got to take the long-term view, not the managers. They've got to drive the managers to take the right view about climate change. So it's a process that's going to take some time. I want to finish by just saying something about Australia-India relations and the opportunities. I mean, obviously, you know, if you look at the size, we're telling me today is 1.2 billion people now. I mean, last time I looked it was 1.1. They're breeding very quickly. 1.2 billion, and on your numbers, their GDP is about 1.7, 1.8 trillion, and ours is about 1.3 trillion, and we've only got 22 million people. And when I look at those two sets of numbers, I say to myself, God, there's got to be massive opportunities between the two. You learning from us helping you, investment, two-way flows. Okay, when you look back, the relationship started, as I understand, about the late 1800s, early 1900s, when we exported coal and horses to India. And we're still exporting coal. I don't think we export horses anymore. Maybe Tinkler, the fellow, is exporting a few horses, but I don't think we export horses. And obviously precious metals, gold and other things. But a very big business, emerging business in tourism, two-way, and of course students, as we mentioned. We haven't handled that relationship well. I mean, we've had incidents at Hungry Jack's which have caused us a very significant fallout in terms of the attitude of people towards Indian students, the attitude of Indian students towards Australians. I think they're all blips, by the way. I don't think they're significant. I think they happen in the best of families, in my view. But behind all those numbers, I see tremendous opportunity. And in the areas that we've talked about in terms of, you know, some of the development of some of the industries, I mean, obviously you have comparative advantage in some things. I mean, a number of people use call centres and technology. I was an Australian advisor to Infosys for a couple of years. I could see the advantage of taking Indian software technology and putting it into Australian enterprises. We worked on bigger companies like Coles or Woolworths or somebody like that. But they could really dramatically upgrade their systems at much lower cost. An obvious opportunity. I don't think we do the education thing at all well. When you were using examples to me outside about the number of people who qualify as accountants and come here and work, I mean, there's got to be a way in which our universities train them in India, and Australian students have got to start studying India as much as Indian students have to start studying in Australia, to make the point simply. So I think, I go through that, tourism, investment, looking at our comparative advantage and looking at the differences in terms of our economic standing, our economic performance. I think there are endless opportunities. I think one of the things that India suffers from is that the major global institutions discriminate a bit against the emerging nations. And the IMF, the World Bank, the old deal, I used to work in the IMF, the old deal, the US gets the control of the World Bank, the chairmanship or the presidency of the World Bank, the Europeans have the IMF, and the Asians got a sop in terms of the Asian Development Bank, but Japan controls that. Now, where are India and China in all that? They are the powerhouses, the emerging, where are they? I tried an exercise a few months ago when the issue of the new leadership of the IMF came up. I wrote a piece in Australian papers which was picked up, proposing that they appoint somebody like Montek Ahluwalia, who's, now I think Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, but has been very close to the Prime Minister for a long time. But an ex-World Bank person, a person who wrote a substantial research report on the role of the IMF, the poor role of the IMF in response to the Asian crisis. Now, I argued it's time to move away from Europe in running the IMF. It's time you pass that over to Asia, and don't pass it to one of the big Asian countries like Japan or Australia. Pass it to one of the smaller emerging nations, and that's why I thought it was a unique opportunity to put somebody like Ahluwalia there who would have had a phenomenal contribution, I think, and would have changed the nature of that institution. And unfortunately, the world is lagging behind the reality, is my final point, in terms of the significance of countries like India and China. Not to say you don't have a lot of domestic and internal problems, and not to say that it's not going to take a lot of time. And as I made the comment about inequality in China, inequality in India is a big issue. These issues are going to be big constraints. But the potential is enormous. And where Australia could use its position is to give India a leg up in some of those forums. As much as we can make business opportunities work, we can make political cooperation work as well. Within the region, I mean, you've had all these East Asian alignments that have excluded India. They finally got into, an expanded ASEAN and East Asian summit. Finally, trilateral commission that I sit on, we finally added India and China, and people like me are complaining that we're in Asia, but the big ones are left out. It's sort of ridiculous. And so I think that just in summary, tremendous possibility in business terms, cooperative terms, opportunity.